Summary of Everyman and His Humour by Ben Jonson. The play starts with a prologue that talks about the goals of the writer. First, Jonson tries to show how deeds and language in Elizabethan London were really like. Second, he wants the play to have people that show an image of the times. If the play is able to show these common mistakes, the audience will laugh at them and agree that there's still hope that they might like men. In the first scene of Act 1, Old Noel asks his helper, Brainworm, to call his son, Edward. Old Noel is glad that Edward seems to be liking his studies, but he worries that he spends too much time on idle poetry. Master Stephen, Noel's nephew, stops by and asks if Edward has any books about hawking and shooting. Noel tells his nephew to stop being wasteful. A servant brings Old Noel a letter meant for Edward, but he chooses to read it first in secret. It is an offer from Wellbred, a rogue from London, for Edward to come spend time in the old jury and get into trouble. Its tone bothers Noel, which makes him worry about the people his son hangs out with and think about whether he should do something about it. Brainworm then gives Edward the letter and doesn't try to hide the fact that Old Noel has already read it. Instead, he tells Edward right away. The letter makes Edward happy, and he plans to meet Wellbred later with Stephen by his side. In another part of the city, the town fool Master Matthew goes to see the cocky soldier Captain Bogadil. Bogadil is staying at the home of Cobb, a water carrier from a lower class. Matthew quotes arrogantly from Thomas Kyd's Spanish tragedy and complains that Wellbred's half-brother, Downright, made fun of his sense of style lately. Bogadil teaches him how to fight with a sword so that Matthew will be ready for any future fights. Act 2 starts at the home of a London cloth seller named Kitely. Kitely talks to Downright about Wellbred, who has been staying with him, and how he acts. Kitely says that Wellbred has been hanging out with bad people and making lascivious jokes in his place. Matthew and Bogadil come by to look for Wellbred. When they find out he isn't there, they leave quickly. Downright gets more and more angry when he hears about Wellbred's actions, and he finds Matthew and Bogadil very annoying. Kitely starts to worry that he is being cheated on when Cobb comes by to bring water. When Dame Kitely and his sister, Mistress Bridget, come to visit, he acts like he has a fever to make them feel better. On London's moorfields, Brainworm enters dressed as a vagrant ex-soldier. He wants to follow Old Noel, who wants to spy on Edward, and tell Edward anything he finds out. Brainworm stays in character when Edward and Stephen show up and sells Stephen a sword. Stephen thinks he got a good deal, but the sword he bought isn't very good. Soon after that, Old Noel comes by to see if he should get involved in Edward's life or stay out of it. Brainworm shows up, still in costume, and asks Old Noel for money. Fitz Sword, Brainworm says, is his name. Old Noel doesn't like the idea, but he agrees to hire Brainworm as a servant, not understanding that the man he is talking to is already one. At the start of Act 3, Bogadil tries to talk to Wellbred about Downright in a nearby bar, but Wellbred won't listen to anything bad about his brother. Edward tells Wellbred that Old Noel read the letter, and the two of them are excited to see what could happen. They both make fun of Stephen, who keeps insisting that his character is very sad even though he is the punchline. Bogadil brags about the wars he has fought in the past, and when he looks at Stephen's sword, he tells him that he was ripped off. Brainworm stops by. Wellbred and Edward laugh as Stephen tries to complain about what he bought. Brainworm shows Edward who he really is and tells him that Edward's father is trying to spy on him. Kitely's anger and fear of being cheated on are getting worse, and he can't focus on his business because of it. Eventually, he leaves to finish a deal. He tells Cash, his servant, to tell him right away if Wellbred and his group show up at the house. Sure enough, the young knights will soon be there. Wellbred and Edward both say that Brainworm is absolutely funny. Wellbred asks Cash if Kitely is inside, and Cash says that Kitely has gone to Justice Clement's. Bogadil lights up some tobacco and says ridiculous things about how good it is. Because the smoke bothers Cobb, Bogadil hits him with a club. Cash tells Cobb to go get Kitely, who is now at the house of Justice Clement, who is in charge of the law in the area. Cobb tells Kitely that Wellbred and his group are at his house. Kitely runs back in a fit of paranoid jealousy, even though Cobb says he didn't see anything wrong. Cobb asks Justice Clement for an order to arrest Captain Bobadil, but when the judge hears more about what happened, he almost throws Cobb in jail for calling tobacco a pig. Act 4 starts back at Kitely's house, where Downright scolds Dame Kitely for letting Wellbred stay there. Dame Kitely says she can't do much about it, though. Mistress Bridget, Matthew, Bobadil, Wellbred, Stephen, Edward, and Brainworm all come in. Mistress Bridget is Kitely's sister. Edward and Wellbred laugh as Matthew steals lines of poetry to try to get Bridget to like him. Right away gets really angry. When Wellbred calls Matthew's actions tricks to Mistress Bridget, some of the characters take this as a sexual code word. Downright is especially angry and tells Wellbred to leave, along with his group. They pull out their knives, but the other people break them up. When Kitely shows up, everyone else except Downright leaves. Straight Up shows how angry he is, and Bridget, Dame Kitely, and Kitely try to cool him down. Kitely is sure that Wellbred and the others are hiding in his house, which makes him think that he has been duped. He goes inside to find them. At home, Cobb starts to think that his wife Tib is cheating on him. He tells her to stay inside and not let anyone in because he thinks she is going out with Bobadil. At the same time, Edward and Wellbred send a word to Brainworm from the tavern. Wellbred says that he wants to help Edward get married to Bridget. Brainworm meets Old Noel again in a street in the Old Jury. Old Noel is with Roger Formal, who works for Justice Clement. He tells Old Noel in a sneaky way that Edward has found out about his father's plans to spy on him and that he had a fight with Edward and his group earlier in the day. Brainworm, as Fitzsword, says that you can find Edward having fun with brave citizens' wives at the house of Cobb. Formal is interested in Fitzsword's life and goes out to drink wine with him. Stephen, Bobadil, Matthew, and Edward talk about Downright. Bobadil and Matthew say they will get him back. Bobadil is excited by this talk of war, so he brags again about how brave he was in battle, where he seems to have been in all of the big ones over the past few years. Then, Downright shows up. He faces Matthew and Bobadil's weapons are easy to take away. Matthew runs away, so Bobadil has to try to explain away his weak actions. Stephen takes the robe that Downright threw away. Back at Kitely's house, Wellbred says that Downright's anger is just part of who he is. Brainworm shows up dressed as Roger Formal and tells Kitely that he has been called by Justice Clement. Kitely looks everywhere for Cash and Cobb to keep watch while he is away. Dame Kitely doesn't understand why her husband is always looking for Cobb. Wellbred hints in a sneaky way that Cobb's wife, Tib, runs a brothel and helps Kitely cheat on her husband. Because Dame Kitely is jealous, she grabs Thomas and goes to Cobb's house. Wellbred focuses on Bridget and tries to get her to marry Edward. Kitely comes back from Justice Clement, who didn't send for him, and runs to Cobb's when he hears that his wife has gone there. Matthew and Bobadil meet Brainworm, who they think is Roger Formal, on the street in London. They ask him for an order to arrest Downright. They give him gold and silk stockings instead of money. Brainworm tells the crowd that he plans to sell these things to make himself look like a sergeant so he can make the arrest. Noel goes to Cobb's house to look for Edward, but Tib has no idea what he's talking about. Kitely and Dame Kitely show up, each thinking that the other is cheating on them. When Cobb hears that his wife Tib did something wrong, he beats her. All of them decide to go to Justice Clement and ask him what he thinks about what has happened. Brainworm, dressed as a sergeant, meets Matthew and Bobadil, who tell him where to find Downright. However, Downright's coat is on Stephen, not Downright. Downright does show up soon, and he agrees to go to Justice Clement, but only if Stephen goes with him because he stole his coat. At the house of the irreverent Justice Clement, Old Noel, Kitely, Dame Kitely, Cash, Tib, and Cobb all get together. He quickly figures out that Noel, Kitely, and Dame Kitely have been tricked by pointing out that both Kitely and his wife got their information from Wellbred. Bobadil and Matthew show up, and Justice Clement is not at all pleased by what he has heard about Bobadil being a coward. Downright shows up with Brainworm and Stephen, which surprises Clement. He makes fun of Downright for agreeing to be jailed without seeing an official warrant. At this point, Brainworm tells the others what he has been doing and tells them that Edward and Bridget are going to get married. Clement is not angry at Brainworm's actions. Instead, he is pleased by them and says that Brainworm should be forgiven for the wit of the offense. Edward, Bridget, Wellbred, and Roger Formal all show up. Clement congratulates the couple on their marriage and makes fun of Matthew's attempts to be romantic. He tells them to have a jolly feast to celebrate the wedding, and he tells them to put away all their troubles. Clement talks in a good mood about how the events of the day will be remembered and praised for a long time.
About the author. Ben Jonson was an important English author and playwright. 2 months before he was born, his father died in 1572. His mother soon married a master builder. Jonson got a good education at Westminster School, where he was taught by William Camden. Jonson later said that he owed Camden all that I am in arts, all that I know. Jonson wanted to go to Oxford University in 1588, but he was not allowed to. Instead, he had to try and learn how to lay bricks, but he failed. Soon after that, he went to the Netherlands, Belgium, and Luxembourg to serve in the war. He might have married in Lewis in 1594. Jonson started working in theater soon after he got out of the army. At first, he was an actor, but soon he also wrote plays. In 1597, he was put in jail for a short time because of the controversial book The Isle of Dogs, of which there is no copy. In 1598, Shakespeare's company, the Lord Chamberlain's Men, put on a play called Everyman in His Humour. It was an attempt to bring the ideas of Latin humor to the English stage. Jonson was put in jail the same year for manslaughter for killing Gabriel Spencer. He avoided the death penalty because of a religious rule. From 1605 on, the court of King James I thought highly of Jonson. The king hired him to write regular plays called masques, which he often did with the well-known designer and builder Inigo Jones. During Charles I's rule, Jonson started to lose favor, but he was still given a regular salary out of respect for Charles's father. Thomas Carew, who was a follower of Jonson, tried to get the famous writer to see that he was getting worse. In 1637, Jonson died and was buried in Westminster Abbey. Many of the wealthy people of the time attended his funeral.
Hope we summarized it fully and you liked it. Please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel so that we are motivated to create more videos.